y ahora el pueblo piensa alzar en la lucha con voces gigantes gritando adelante. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
Thank you very much for wonderful speeches, and your experience, Napoleon, your experience especially makes me really sad. This is what's going on in Mexico, and this is a clear example that a case that the so-called labor chapter of NAFTA is not working in favor of the working class. But it appears to me that still major trade unions around the world, they insist labor chapter on most free trade agreements, right? And I mean, I'm wondering. I mean, I'm wondering what you think of the labor chapter and why the major trade unions are still insisting the labor chapter. And that one, having said that, and it's not NAFTA it's not just the one free trade agreements that the negatively affects the working class in Mexico and in Canada and in the United States. There are other free trade agreements. Mexico signed free trade agreements with the European Union, and European Union signed a free trade agreement with Canada. Now EU is trying to sign an agreement with the United States, the Atlantic Trade Investment Partnership. And I'm wondering what you think of the impact, the potential impact of the new free trade agreements on workers in these three countries, and especially in Mexico. And given that the major trade unions in Europe, they are also calling for more strict labor chapter. It seems that turning blind eye to what's going on in the last 6 or 7 years in Mexico, as if they don't know such things, right? I guess that's the major the question that I would like to ask.
Okay. Let's see, one or two more questions, and we'll answer. Larry?
Sure. I wanted to take up this question about this intercontinental trade unions. I'm in favor of having relationship between all the unions, north, south, east, west, whatever. But the problem is, if you look at the Constitution, you're going to have to change the whole structure or the leadership of these, especially the craft union, because in the old days, in the late 50s, when McCarthy reared its head, you would have elections in Vancouver. The international headquarters in the States would come in and say, these guys are communists, and expel them.
Yeah.
See, and therefore you got to have autonomy within the country, and then have joint relationship on which you agree with, on trade union principles. So I think the idea of intercontinental alliances based on cooperation on trade union principles is great, but we got to be clear about this, because in the old days, and even recently, you get these international bureaucrats from Washington who are, they're making them $500,000. So they see opposition going within certain locals, they'll just move in and expel them. So we got to take those things into consideration.
Okay, those were big questions, so let's respond to them. Who would like to go first? Napoleon.
Let me talk about your question first. I think when the NAFTA agreement was signed 21 years ago, they neglected completely the labor rights of the workers who were going to be involved in this. So, but suddenly under the pressure of the trade unions, they had to introduce a chapter to respect labor rights, and and the collective bargaining agreements and the freedom to organize, and all that was guaranteed. Unfortunately, I mean, nobody from the government, nobody cares about that. Nobody respects that. It did not enforce, even if there is a chapter in the NAFTA agreement, nobody respects that. Nobody does anything against that. So the cries and the shouts of the trade unions are completely ignored by our governments of Canada, United States, and Mexico. So when the trade unionists and in any other parts of the world are fighting for be more strict on the rights of the workers to be guaranteed by all these trade agreements, is something important that have to be enforced and really respected, because otherwise it gives the impression, and from what I have studied about this Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, and they're going to expand the exploitation of the workers. This is just like a more like geographical or geopolitical instrument that I want to probably to promote all these countries to stop the growth of China and maybe some other Asian countries in the world economy, and also to increase the power of all these multinational department stores and commercial Walmarts and many others in the world, and give them the free access to all these markets. And when there is no competition, it's going to be much more difficult for the workers to have a better standard of living, a better way of living. So I think this is why probably they have kept this secretly. I mean, the signing of this, which probably in the next few months or weeks, maybe they will sign that the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. But I think if it's signed as we believe, it's going to increase the degree of exploitation of the working class and of the middle class. So I think this is why we have to fight strong, but together internationally in solidarity, to be more exert pressure on the governments to respect the labor rights and the human rights of the workers involved in all these nations. Right. So far, 12 nations. So, from Latin America, I think it's only Chile, Peru, and Mexico. But it's Canada, it's United States, and many others. I think Malaysia and many others, South Korea and others. So I think we have to put pressure on the governments, but they haven't opened these negotiations, so it doesn't smell good for the trade union movement. I mean, this is why they haven't opened that to discussions or to give or have the opinions of trade unionists or many other social and political organizations. So I think we have to work harder on that. And I insist on the international solidarity. I think we have to work together, but with clear objectives of how to work, and with commitment and with really passion to do what and to fulfill our responsibilities. Because it is true. The companies, if they see that you are weak, being a trade unionist, they will fire you, they will destroy your union. So we have to be stronger, and I think unity gives that strength, and the strength gives the power to confront the exploitation and the globalization of multinational companies and governments, which once they want to continue on the exploitation of the labor force and the natural resources of our countries. So I think this would be my comments. Jim, maybe you want to add some other comments? Thank you.
First of all, on the question of labor chapters, in Canada, around NAFTA, we didn't support chapters. We said we're opposed to the fundamental part of the agreement. The U.S. trade union movement was more into the chapters, and the Mexican movement was completely out of the chapters because they were supporting the whole agreement. Besides, with notable exceptions, the FAT, the telephone workers, Los Mineros, a number of Mexican unions in the independent movement. But the trade union movement in Mexico embraced NAFTA and said it was a bunch of selfish North American gringos who were trying to protect their jobs, and this would bring thousands and thousands of jobs to Mexico. In fact, it did bring thousands of jobs to Mexico. I don't think anybody can argue with that. That latest article in Monterrey, where you're from, that the industrial area there has boomed as more and more companies have shut down and moved production. I spent some time in Tijuana for the book and for a conference there, And it was very true. It was sort of a shocking reality to sit at the border at night, travel the day, visited factories in there during the day, full of people, every sign, help wanted sign, every factory, then go to the border and watch hundreds and hundreds of people every night try to sneak across the border to go to work. And if you say to them, well, you can work in your own factories, why are you going there? Well, they look at me and say, that's teenagers' work. That's $3 a day or $4 a day. I can make $25 in California field. What would you do, gringo? I mean, the fact is, the economic model itself is completely upside down. On the chapters as well, I mean, there was a couple challenges. Labor tried to do some challenges under the NAFTA thing. We failed. They weren't put there. They were a sop to the labor movement in the United States by Bill Clinton to say, okay, this is what we should do to make it all better for everybody. Those will not work. And the new agreements are even better at taking away any chance of unions to do that work. So I don't see any rights in any of the new ones, including the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. They're not even considering those options now. They're just way beyond that. This is about securing access to markets and securing protections for capital and securing power over workers. That's what the whole thing is about. And that's really what it's about. And I noticed, I mean, in my own industry, I watched this happen in the fishing industry in British Columbia, because the key to the whole thing, in a simple sense, is to take away the rights of us as democracies to control capital, take away the rights of us to control what happens to our resources, so that we can't bring in laws anymore that say you have to process and add value to resources here, which is what a country does if it wants to be successful. At the same time, you have to take away the second piece of that. It's not okay just to send all the fish to the United States or to China to process. You have to have the right to bring it back in that country and be guaranteed that right. So at the end of the day, the free trade agreements guaranteed two fundamental rights for capital. One was to exploit and export the resources of our country to whichever country they want, without fear that we would demand they add value to those resources, which, by the way, was the model we used. The second resource is we built a country where we used to celebrate branch plants. Much the same way that it's not all Mexican corporations now that are doing the manufacturing sector in Japan. Many, you drive down those streets when I was there, and I'm sure if you drove down the streets of Monterey, you would recognize many of the signs on the factories. These are international, global companies that have moved their production to where they consider the cheapest labor zones. And so that's what you're getting as a result of these trade agreements, is that transfer of that capital. But they got to be able to bring the TV back across the border, or bring the car back across the border, all this across the border. And so we had managed trade for years. There's nothing wrong with that. We're not against trade. This wasn't about trade. We had an auto workers agreement with auto workers between the two countries that said if you build a car, if you sell a car in Canada, you have to build one here. What a novel idea, one for one. We built our whole industry on that. We had tariffs on many goods because we recognized that there were challenges. We lived in a country with winter. It was more expensive. Our growing season was different. So we built a series of structures in Canada that protected our industries and developed them, allowed them to develop. At the same time, we could develop our rights in that context. They stripped all of that away. And that's what's happened. And so the labor chapters, I mean, I think we have to think this through. I don't think we can say, okay, we want to go back to the old way. We're going to find new ways to do this, but at the root of it has to give back some democratic control to people's democracy. And we're a long way from that international power and democracy to get there, because the UN isn't going to do this for us. These are corporations and right-wing governments signing these trade agreements to do that, and that's what it's about. On the question of international unionism, I mean, again, you have to start with each country, and where does that come from? I mean, we're one of the few countries in the world where we have international unions. Most countries don't. We have a history, but I would make this argument. I've seen Canadian unions that are as undemocratic as some of the international unions are at times. I don't think it's a matter of nationality, it's a matter of the tradition in the union and how it treats democracy within its borders. And if we're going to create new institutions, that one of the challenges has to be, however we create them, they have to be democratic. We have to have, working people have to have power to direct their unions. And that's a challenge for us, in a way in which democracy gets taken away so many fronts. The last place we can afford to lose that is in the labor movement. Because the democracy is where our power comes from. And workers that are not connected to their union and not feeling that they can have a say in their union, they're not going to fight for that union. So it's a challenge. And I want to say it's not easy. It's a tough fight, right? It's not an easy fight. But, cautiously optimistic that we'll continue to push that frontier forward. And that's where international solidarity becomes so important, because there's lots of unions around the world that have a strong democratic tradition. Starting with, Napoleon's union and other unions around this world that have very strong democratic traditions. And we need to learn from each other what democracy looks like. And not what it looks like 40 years ago. but what it's going to look like 40 years from now in the labor movement. Because that's really the challenge for us, is to define a new kind of democracy, new kind of international relationships, where we are just as strong and share just as much and are just as strategic as the international corporations are now with their strategic plans. And we're a ways from that yet. It's harder for us. But you know what? We'll get there. I'm optimistic that we're going through a phase where we're starting to find our way, and we'll come out of this phase and reclaim much of our planet. Because if we don't, there won't be much of a planet for the next generation if we don't reclaim a lot of it. So, comments.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, in the back.
I'd like to ask a question. The young lady, to my mind, hit upon what is our problem in that we're relying on a broken reed under these trade agreements. 1984, it was known at the time. All this was inevitable. But as she was pointing out, the trade unions went for this and asked for support from their people to help get this 1984 free trade agreement passed. Even though those who looked very deeply at what was involved knew darn well it wasn't about trade, it was about investment, the sanctity of a dollar, and that was all that mattered. Your environmental rules, well, heck with that. All the things of concern, quality of life for ordinary people, no importance. You were sidelined, as was pointed out at the very beginning. Countries became vassal states of these trade pacts, and it's getting worse. It's not improving. What is happening? Because unfortunately, those who wanted to inform, and we had a real Canadian heroine trying to inform with very well aware people across our country, but they were snowed under in all the propaganda in the media, which if you were here, you remembered right at the end, they said you were a bunch of cowards in Canada if you didn't go for this free trade agreement. You know, it was like the casino boys coming into town and telling you all you'd get if you'd ever let us put in a casino here. But this is all the stuff that working people are up against all around the world. And when you see black workers in South Africa being killed by the official police there, and we're doing the same thing in our country, but a little more subtly. The point being, you workers have to kowtow to our national agreements. And even though we are of no worth, you have to go along with what we have decided for you and for our country. But it's all been, ever since 1984, when countries were made subservient and decisions were offshore in a star chamber. They didn't have to give their reasons. They just said, okay, you're going to pay a $30 million fine for trying to protect your environment. And this is the kind of rule of thumb. We're back in the not the dark ages, but, you know, medieval times now. Because the almighty dollar is what is worshipped, not what is respected, ordinary people, and our environment, which we have to protect for our future children. Anything goes, and BC is in the front line with the Chinese money coming in for any development we'll ever have that our premier wants. You know, it's so clear that what is important for ordinary people is not put up there on a pedestal for everybody to be aware of, and learning that and standing up for it, unless we're willing to put it up at the front and, well, bang heads over it. We're not going to educate ordinary people about what they're up against. So I really, the leadership has to be more interested in the fine points, as it were.
Thank you. I'd like to comment on that, if I may. I think that I agree mostly with what you said, though the trade unions didn't support. It varied by the country. The Mexican official unions totally supported NAFTA. The Canadian trade unions fought against the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in a very big mobilization and battle that seemed at times to have possibilities of defeating it. The U.S. trade union movement opposed NAFTA, but at the last minute, Clinton made these concessions on the
Labor and the environment.
the labor and environment.
Yeah.
The labor was definitely done in a way, if you look at the specific mechanisms, it was done to be toothless. It was done to be not enforced. It was just to win votes in Congress. It was a sop. And I think given the power structures, given the correlation of forces, as I think Jim said, or Napoleon, that these new trade agreements have no hope of having serious labor enforcement things. But the main point I would make about is that I think we have to be very careful, and this is a thing we emphasize in the book, I think. We emphasize in the book, we have to be very careful to not lay all the blame on trade agreements. What really we're talking about is a concerted, thought-out offensive by big business to smash the working class, to privatize everything. Public schools are a big front of privatization now. Water is another big front. I mean, this corporate offensive started way before NAFTA. And what NAFTA does and what the TPP proposes to do with these other trade agreements is to consolidate it in ways, deepen and widen it in ways that make it very, very hard for any countries to opt out without tremendous cost. It's to tie the hands of future governments. The present governments of these countries will continue to carry out the offensive, but it's to tie the hands of future governments to restrict rights, etc. The trade agreements are tremendously important, but they're not the source of the problem. They're a tool of the capitalist offensive, and a very important one. The other thing I would just raise as a question, Jim, in his comments, was talking about a model of fighting back to reestablish a better balance between labor and capital. I want to go back to a kind of period before, when we had stronger unions that were able to force some important concessions from capital. I have great doubts that we can go back to that. I have great doubts that we can go back, especially when you think of the environment, which Jim correctly, I hate to say correctly, criticizes the book for not bringing in strongly enough. But when you're taking into account the environment, I don't think the environment can be saved under capitalism. And I don't think, given the transformations that capitalism has gone through, this globalization, I don't think we can go back to Keynesianism. And I think really that, call it what you may, but I think socialism, democratic socialism, has to come back on the agendas. I think there's no way of changing things without really challenging the power of capital. And I think to challenge the power, thank you, and to challenge the power of capital without taking away their power is to give them the ability to smash you as soon as they get their act back together. And that's what happened. In the 30s and 40s, the working class in the advanced countries were able to force capital to give major concessions. But then, with more international competition, and when capital decided they didn't want to give concessions anymore, it broke the social pact. The pacts were a little different in Mexico than Canada-U.S., but it was the same thing. And so I think that I would raise that. Yes.
I was just wondering, when you talk about social trade unions and socialism, I was wondering how the trade unions fighting against these tribunals that are embedded in NAFTA, and they might well be embedded in the Comprehensive European Trade Agreement that allows companies in foreign lands to sue the government and undermine the sovereignty of the government. And I wondered, does the trade union movement fight this as well? Because you're right, it comes under socialism rather than union rights, right? In a sense, but it seems to me that the tribunals are really destructive.
Mm-hmm. One of you guys want to comment on that?
Just a couple of points. One is I just want to take a bit of issue with what happened when the free trade fights happened in Canada. I don't think we lost the debate with the Canadian people. In fact, I was a big part of that debate, and I think we won the debate with the Canadian people. And in the election that was really the free trade election as we knew it in 1988, 65% of British Columbians voted for two parties that were solidly against free trade. I mean, again, our democracy failed us on this point, clearly, because 35% of the people elected a government that supported free trade, and 65% voted against the government that supported free trade. We ended up with free trade. And this goes back to, I think, my earlier point, which is we have to reform democracy as well as the labor movement. It goes hand in hand. We have to be more democratic so we have some rights to control that. Personally, I think part of that is having a different electoral system in Canada, so proportional representation comes into play, and suddenly we have a different struggle and a different democratic moment for us to deal with. And those are things we have to set above the battle for the short-term gains. To restructure democracy would be a major victory for us if we did it properly. So I think that point I just wanted to make. On the question of going back, I'm not arguing to go back to the good old days. I'm arguing to go forward to the better days, because I think countries all over the world are doing that. I think if you look at Latin America today, when I got involved in Latin America, 90% of those countries were dictatorships, military dictatorships. If you went to visit the labor movement, you could find them in jail, hiding in the mountains or in the graveyard. And that was the story of how many Latin American countries for how long. And that was the decision of the United States to enforce its will in those countries, and by the rich in those countries to support that system of imperialism. And that's what it was. If you look today, the things that have been done in places like Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela and on and on and on to restructure how division of labor goes, the distribution of wealth, and to create new popular institutions of democracy is pretty amazing. Now they're being attacked. There's a counter-revolution. There's an attack on them. But let me tell you, if you think you can do this without confronting power, you can't. You might as well just, as Frederick Douglass said, you expect change without the clap of thunder and the strike of lightning. That ain't going to happen.
Well, the free trade agreement we can get out of in 6 months.
In 6 months, and we can. And we have to start thinking about how we do that.
And work at getting that out.
That's right. Yeah. On this tribunal thing, and I will just say something about free trade. It's not a new thing, by the way. Canada had a free trade debate in 1912. It was called reciprocity, and it was about a free trade agreement with the United States. And we had that debate, and we won the debate, frankly, at that point. And it was rejected, even though the West wanted it, the farmers wanted it, the industrial heartland rejected it, including, by the way, the companies. That was the difference in this one. The companies supported this deal. They become international. They decided. In the fishing industry, they actually were opposed to it. As soon as it passed, they bought fish plants in the United States and started sending fish down the United States and trying to break the union during the strike. Okay, I saw it happen. I lived it daily. So you know that was part of the thing. On the tribunals, I think I don't have a lot of hope that we can win some concessions within this debate about CETA or TPP or these things, that the labor movement or working people can win the concessions we're describing here that would be effective. We can win maybe a piece of paper that says labor is important, but we lived through that with NAFTA, and it didn't work. You can't point to a single example where that had any impact on what happened, both in the environmental and the other way. What we saw was the NAFTA agreement being used to attack our decision to ban lead in gasoline and to ban other chemicals, and they said you have no right to do that because that's interfering in our business. We had to pay fines to those companies. When we took over Abitibi Paper, and they fled town and said we're closing down, and the Newfoundland government took back the power and said, well, if you're not going to use the power for the plant, we're not giving it to you. And we ended up paying a $100 million fine for exercising our right to take that power back because it belonged to us. So again, I think we have to fight these agreements. There isn't a lot of compromise. We're not in a position to bargain them. It's part of a longer-term process of letting people understand why this is the wrong way to go. So, it's a big part of it.
Yeah.
But education through
Can I
struggle.
Yes, please.
You learn
Just
to
a few
fight.
comments.
With Napoleon.
Yeah, I just like to add a short comment to this. One of the fears that we have and concerns that we have with this new trade, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, is that the companies are going to have, multinational companies, more power to present lawsuits against governments and win and be successful. And this is something that we haven't seen before. I mean, that companies can present lawsuits against any government, and this is something that this is why we have to be very, very careful and keep inform the people and fight together. I mean, together the trade unions, because what is at stake is the power and the survival of trade unionism against the interest of all these multinational companies. And we have to be this beyond borders working together. It's going to affect really in worse conditions the exploitation of the people and the working class. Let me just mention one of the things that Richard said just about Mexico and the energy reform. Well, they call it reform. It's not a progressive, it's a counter-reform on the energy sector. Yeah. Now, for instance, in Mexico, what was approved by Congress is that if you own a piece of land and you discover oil or gas, and then the company will come and Shell or whoever, Exxon, and will say, I want your piece of land, I will pay you this amount of money. And you don't accept that you want to sell the property, then the government can expropriate the land and give it to the company. Yeah. I mean, it's terrible. We're going backwards. Yeah. I mean, of course, this is going to have an effect because people is getting more and more aware of all this kind of corruption that is prevailing, and the privatization of the natural resources that still are in the Constitution, which belong to the nation, to the people of Mexico, but they are using and interpreting this as the way they want. So we have to keep fighting. As you said, Jim, as Richard, is a fight against power. It's a world-class struggle between two different completely interests. They want to destroy the unions, particularly democratic and independent unions, and we want to survive and keep fighting for for political democracy and social justice. So this was something that I'm very also we'll say positive, or I think that we are going to succeed if we keep fighting, because you will see a lot of problems in Mexico very soon. Mm-hmm. There will be a big social unrest out of the insecurity and the exploitation and the unemployment and the corruption that prevails. People is getting tired of this. I mean, all these social and political movements that are happening in the Arab countries, I mean, it didn't come out from one day to the other. It took 30 years or 40 years or 50 years of dictatorship and corruption and exploitation, and suddenly one day they decide to go out to the streets, and then so this is something that it may happen. If it doesn't happen at this moment, the big multinational companies are in a very comfortable position, just taking advantage of the natural resources, and I'm sure the day that this happens, of course, one of the most interested in keeping peace there would be the United States government, because it's the border, 3,000 kilometers of border. And they will say, you have to do something or reforms in Mexico to benefit the people. And if they don't do it, probably they will go beyond that. I mean, they will suggest to have a change in government. And this is the history, what it has proved to us. I mean, in the long history that we have with the Americans. And, we lost 4 territories in the 19th century out of this. I mean, so we have to be very, very careful and keep inform the people and working together with commitment, with passion, and doing what we have to do in order to really survive and keep fighting for the welfare, for the future of the people of our and the new generations to come. So, thank you, Richard. And I think, and I was going to say, We have to read. Everybody should read your book, Richard.
you.
Really, I recommend that very highly. Thank you. It's very important. Really.
Thank you. You should also read Napoleon's book, which unfortunately is not here today, which I just finished reading. It's a terrific read.
Could you tell us the title again?
The title is
Collapse of Dignity.
Collapse of Dignity. There it is. Napoleón Gómez.
Yeah, I have one. I have one just to wait for this. Yeah.
Okay, other.
Is it available here?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, I don't know if it's in the bookstore.
Usually, in the other bookstores, you can find.
Bingo.
I have a question regarding organizing. The discussion so far was still using very much the language of international solidarity, implying that workers start organizing nationally and then start working together. And as far as public sector unions, workers go, I think that's kind of just inevitable because the state is your employer. So that's what you're up against to get a national union. But what came up over again in your presentations and in other discussions about globalization is this shipping around jobs. Like as soon as a union organizer shows up, you close down your shop and move somewhere else. And my what I was thinking about, but I couldn't come up with an answer and throw it just out here. Maybe any of the speakers or anybody else has an idea on that. Was whether we shouldn't start thinking about organizing entire supply chains. And the example that always comes to my mind is what would the world look like if instead of the Trans-Pacific Partnership as designed by the capitalists, we would have workers in China organizing Foxconn, producing lots of the stuff that ends up in the stores in North America, and at the same time having workers in retail, workers in Mexico, Canada, and the United States, like at Walmart, and ironically the U.S. is somewhat in the forefront of organizing those kind of workers, much more than is happening in Canada at this point. What would the world look like if we had these manufacturing workers in China organizing in the same union and coordinating their demands with the demands of retail workers in North America? So that, like in the old days, you had these industrial unions that pretty much controlled or organized an entire supply chain. At some point, Ford Motor Company, they had their own steel production, so that the auto workers at the Ford Motor Company would be kind of controlling or negotiating on behalf of workers from steel making to selling cars. And this with all the outsourcing. You have a parts maker here, you have Frank Stronach from Austria there. Kind of gives you this patchwork of production, which was only set up actually to break these integrated industrial unions. Now, with those industries turned into a patchwork, maybe we have to try kind of to piece that together by following these supply chains and organizing along those supply chains. That's kind of my think. What I cannot figure out is how you actually do that and what would be the demands bringing these workers together. So I think it's a great idea to organize supply chains, and I'd be happy if anybody could tell me how to do that.
Okay, I'm not going to tell. I think that's a great question, and I just want to add to the question. I don't have the answer here. Who would be the agency of organizing? And we could think of different models. Do they get organized separately and then coalesce, or do we need something like an equivalent of industrial or something like that to organize supply chains? So I'm not answering the question, I'm just specifying it a little more. So we expect two brilliant answers from you two guys. You've had 30 seconds to think about it. Jim, you want to come up here for our TV viewers abroad?
I always think of these things in context, because in the fishing industry, the forest industry, the mining industry in Canada, it took 30 to 50 years to organize the supply chains, okay? And they didn't even organize all of them. But just to establish a sectoral agreement in those industries took 30 or 40 years. So when you think about doing that around the world, thank God it's a different world and a lot smaller, but it is a huge task. My most recent example where I thought, and it didn't ultimately turn into what we hoped, but industrial, when the IKEA workers were locked out here, we realized early on that this was not a battle to be won there. That the company made $4 billion in the last year profit, and that there was no economic leverage at this place. All they had was a brand that we had to affect, and we had to affect something far greater than that place there. That was the problem. And so, to make a long story short, at some point, through a lot of work through the Transportation Federation, the waterfront unions here, industrial, we set up a working group that included people from England, from Sweden, from the Swedish Union for IKEA, from the Teamsters, and from a Teamsters coordinating committee, industrial IKEA group, okay? And we ended up trying to negotiate directly with IKEA in Sweden to make the agreement. And we also ended up organizing actions at ports all around the world to stop the flow of goods to IKEA. Now, at the end of the day, we could not extract the collective agreement we were looking for in that circumstance. But I remember being on conference calls 2 or 3 times a week with all of those people talking about strategies, and it was refreshing to me, to say the least. It was exciting, and I started to feel like, okay, this is how it can work, right? People can really change the relationship around these things and not be caught in your little corner where you don't have the power if you get out of it. And I'm sure, Napoleon has other examples of that, and there are more and more examples of that, but it's going to take that kind of international coordination and long-term strategy for industries. I agree with that, and as I say, I think, especially after I lived through that experience, boy, it could be very powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Napoleon, do you want to say
Well, just to give you an example, we have been trying to organize the automotive industry and the auto parts industry. And we have really had a lot of opposition from the companies, multinational companies, government, local governments, federal governments, what we call the rat unions, the official unions, and the corruption that prevail. And so we have to go beyond. What we have done is going to the international chain of producers. For instance, in the auto parts industry, we have been trying to organize for now 3 or 4 years the big company which is established it's called PKC in the border with the United States, and it has 7,500 workers. But everybody's against us because they don't want Los Mineros. We have 3 and 4 times the wages of the rest. They pay very low wages. This is what they bring. But we have gone to the Auto Workers Union in the United States and Canada, and in Europe, in Italy, and in Germany to put pressure on the main company, for Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and BMW, in order to squeeze them and put pressure. If you don't allow the workers to organize and be members of Los Mineros, our union, then we'll have problems with us in Germany, in Italy, in the United States, in Canada. So this is what we have been doing lately. And I hope that we will succeed finally in organizing these workers because they want to be members of our union. In the law is, of course, the freedom of organization, or the freedom of association, but they don't respect that. So with only this kind of pressure, and just to give this example of the automotive industry, because it's really something amazing how all they collude together to stop democracy in unions and to stop workers to be organized by democratic and independent unions. They prefer the official unions or no unions at all, only outsourcing companies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
We're on the verge of May Day. How many people do you think will be showing up in, let's say, Mexico City on May 1st? And how many will be showing up in Vancouver, Ottawa, or anywhere else in Canada?
Well, you can answer in Mexico.
Yeah, I like from Mexico. Unfortunately, in Mexico, very few. Every single year, all the official unions have made this like a anniversary date and with few speeches, not a big rally. And then we have like 3 different rallies and demonstrations. The official ones that they don't do any demonstration, they just go with an act with the president of Mexico. They get together with his cabinet and they give speeches, and that's it. In the offices of the president of Mexico, whatever. Only the union leaders. Then we have the independent and democratic unions. We march together. Unfortunately, also between democratic unions, there are differences. So we march to separate the groups. And for us, it's very important because we want to be with all of them. But even talking about what you mentioned between the public sector unions and the private company unions, it is true. For instance, we have the case of the SME, the Electrical Workers Union in Mexico. It was a national company, and 6 years ago, the government decided in one day to declare in bankruptcy the company in order to destroy the union, and 44,000 workers were fired one day. And they took with the army the offices, they disappeared the company, and they're still fighting around 15,000 of them. The rest, probably they collect their money because they deposit the money in the labor councils, but they keep fighting, and some of the group of about 15,000. We have been working in solidarity with them. But then there are some other democratic unions that are democratic maybe in the speech, but not so much on the facts. For instance, I would make a criticism of, a friendly criticism of, for instance, the Telephone Workers Union. They are very good in the speeches and very progressive, but in fact, they go to negotiate with Carlos Slim, the owner of the telephone company, and they get 3%, 4%. We get 10, 12, and 14% every single year in all the negotiations.
That's why you are here.
And this is why I'm here. This is why I was expelled from Mexico. And this is why I'm here. This is why we are here. My wife is right. She's there. This is why they didn't want us to be leading the trade union movement in Mexico. But this is something, so we have to go and rally different, and we do like 2 different rallies. But unfortunately, every year has become from I don't know. I remember in 2003 and in 2004, before I had to leave Canada in 2006, I addressed the big crowd in the main square of Mexico City. We were more than 100,000 people there. I have the pictures and everything there. I addressed them for 2 separate years. And but since then, with the conservative governments of Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderón, the right-wing governments, they try to separate and break the union. So they now demonstrate one is the official ceremony with the traditional and the official unions, and the other one is on the streets. But
is it a holiday?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an official holiday. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's an official holiday.
Yes, well, that's not true here.
I don't know in Canada how is this? No.
Didn't it used to be?
No, in Canada, we there was a Royal Commission in 1899, and it made a series of recommendations, good things, by the way. And the only one that was accepted was that they established Labor Day in Canada on September, and they declared that Labor Day a holiday, in part to undercut the idea that May Day should be a holiday.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the labor movement wanted May Day to be the holiday.
Yeah, May Day, yeah, sure.
Right. So, May Day was a tradition here, and it has been for a long time.
Yeah.
It's gone up and down over the years.
Yeah.
But Labor Day is a day the labor movement celebrates more than May Day.
Yeah.
Now, there's a rally on May Day, and we've always done that. I've been going to May Day rallies since I was a teenager. But they're never big. Yeah. The biggest one was an HE, was on strike. We had about 5,000 people or 8,000 people. Yeah. Otherwise, they're not big. It's not a traditional holiday in Canada. It simply isn't.
When I first came to Canada, I was very confused about Labor Day and May Day, because for us May Day, May Day is
most of the world.
1st of May, everywhere. Yeah, right.
Only in the United
States. And then you say Labor
Canada.
Day in September. What is it? But anyway, so now I understand much better.
That's right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
In Mexico, you talked about the rising unrest and that you fear that there's going to be explosions coming, and you talked about how that happened in the Middle East, and we know that in many parts around the world that this kind of unrest and inequality has resulted because of sort of a poor left vision, the rise of extremism and fascism. Do you see some kind of fundamentalism rising in Mexico that we have to be aware of. That's,
Yeah, I think there are many. The conditions are deteriorating every single year. Yeah, and I think also the awareness of people and the social consciousness has developed, and at the degree in which, if you see, for instance, now, and you make a survey of what the opinion of the people is towards the government or the president, you won't find more than 20% in favor. And that's something when they used to be 50, 60 or maybe more, because the free party used to have control of the people.
Right.
But now not anymore. And even the official unions, the trade unions, and the politicians are so, really they have lost the confidence of people. So it might come, I don't know, some kind of different problems or unrest, but I don't know. But I don't think things will continue like this for many years. I don't think so.
So
Even for this government.
Are the people turning to the left, or are they turning to fascism and fundamentalism?
Well, maybe some to the left, but some others more toward social conscience and movements and against corruption, against the abuses of power, against repression, against the violent situation that Mexico is facing.
Yeah, I'd like to elaborate a tiny bit on what Napoleon said. I think there is a tradition of kind of fascist movement in Mexico, and it's sort of located around the PAN party, what do they call Yunque? Yunque,
yeah.
Catholic under secret groups with power connections.
Yeah.
But there doesn't seem to be, I've been talking to other Mexican journalists recently about it, there doesn't seem to be that move to fascist, racist right. There probably are some of those sentiments in the upper classes, in the upper class youth. You find sometimes very derogatory remarks about working people and so on. But, I think, one thing that's going on is, which we touched on, but it's a tremendous growth of the tremendous militarization of Mexico in different ways. The drug cartels have armies, and a lot of these armies are made up of young people who might otherwise be engaged in some kinds of constructive or not constructive protests or whatever, but they're recruited into these armies, and these armies are run by the drug capitalists. Are some of them ideological? Maybe, but not. I don't think generally. I think they're done. They make deals with the PAN. They make deals with the PRI, whoever. The other thing that's developing in Mexico. I've just been reading the book by Hernandez Navarro about the self-defense groups, a Mexican journalist. There's a tremendous growth of self-defense groups because communities in poorer states are under attack by the army, by drug cartels, by the local police. They have no way of defending themselves, so they're organizing to defend themselves. So you have a nation in which there's tremendous armaments, and I think, and certainly Napoleon is, even though he's in Vancouver, because he talks all the time to his comrades in the Union, has a better sense of this. I talk a lot to Edur, and the sense that I get from Edur, the guy I write with, who lives in Mexico City, is that something's got to give, that there are going to be social explosions. But when and in what form is not clear. And right now, there were tremendous protests, some of the biggest protests in decades after the massacre last September. Mm-hmm. Yep. Those protests have declined. So Edur was telling me 2 days ago, the 26th, was the 7th month anniversary. Yeah. There were protests all over Mexico, but according to Edur, they were not particularly big. So maybe, there's an ebb and flow of movements, but I think, The problem, and there are many movements, like Napoleon referred to the anti-violence movement. There's this very significant peace movement in Mexico, peace movement against the drug war. There are a lot of movements, but they're very, there's a mosaic of movements. There's a lot of ferment, but they don't cohere yet into some central thing. And I think what's missing is some unifying program, unifying vision. I'm not saying this, what?
An alternative.
An alternative, exactly. There's different, and then there's a big division also on elections. You know, the moderate parties of the center left are there's two now that are very bitterly divided, and there's some people who feel elections are worthless in the context of all the repression. Any other questions or comments? No, I think we'll close. So I want to just thank everybody for coming. I guess I should say that I always find that buy my book. Fernwood's a wonderful small press. And I made $90 last year. I want to go above 100 this year. And no, but the main thing is try to help figure things out and fight the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks to the two great speakers.
Thank you. Richard, what is the name of your friend?
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to all of you. And I would like to underscore what Richard said. Buy his fine book, especially because this book represents the thin end of the wedge of us getting proper supplier relations going with Fernwood and Brunswick again. So we're trying to, that's now one molecule wide. We're trying to widen it tonight. Also, I forgot to mention earlier another very important event coming up. May Day, and May Day is also the first day of our annual 30% off sale on everything in politics, philosophy, political economy, and labor. And because that's only 48 hours away, if you want to take advantage of that tonight, we can do that. So, but do come back sometime during the month of May and browse our fine labor section and our pretty good politics, philosophy section. And yes, if you find a Fernwood book, pick it up and it'll help us get more of their books in here. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Yes, send it to me, please. Thank you. Okay.